Greetings and welcome to Geoscience, Ethics, and Understanding Public Lands. You may be wondering, why cover this topic in physical geology? That's a great question. I'm going to share some stories today and give you some practical, not just advice, but important information that could be useful to you as you travel, as you go to places, because most people like to pick up rocks, fossils, and minerals and feel as if it's okay to do so. Some places that is absolutely correct. Others they are not. For example, the picture you're seeing here, one of my favorite places in South Dakota, which is Sylvan Lake, part of Custer State Park, it would be very illegal to pick up anything without a permit. It's a state park. They have regulations that prohibit that. So we're going to learn about why geoscientists, which include geologists and other types of people in the field, have to practice what are generally considered good scientific ethics. And we'll talk about the why and the how part, and then we're going to get into understanding what public lands are and some of the dilemmas about the intersection of public lands or adjacent properties to private lands, tribal lands, state trust lands, what all of these things are and why they're important to the field of geoscience. So the term geoscience ethics is one that should be looked at with a frame around it that designates appropriate behavior that's legal and conducive to good scientific research and knowledge and gain in the field of science. So what do I mean by that? You're seeing some images of very good examples of people doing scientific ethical research, studies, and education. And that's important because when it's done correctly, science can help people understand and piece together the Earth's history. And each and every study adds to the pool of learning that grows over time. So when something's done in a way that's not ethical, not legal, or sets a bad example for the public, maybe it's done haphazardly or not using good scientific method to make that applicable to the field of science. These are the things that all geoscientists need to think about as they're doing their work, not just in the field, but when they get home to do the work in the lab, when they publish their materials, what they put online. All of these things are part of geoscience ethics. So we look at them as moral principles. And sometimes the word ethics and moral compass come into play, and people are like, oh, this is just a lesson in do's and don'ts. Well, kind of. But some of those do's and don'ts actually have legal parameters around them that make things either permissible or not permissible under federal law and sometimes international law. So let's take a look at the goals of geoscience ethics, because in the long run, geoscientists are all about protecting our resources that we have on planet Earth. And we're wanting to learn about how our Earth works, how planetary structures were made, their history. That includes rocks, fossils, minerals, and everything involved with geology. So let's do it in a way that's conducive to the field of education and science, but also protects the world that we all love and live in. For example, you see this scientist examining a protected rock layer in a national forest. This is out by the Grand Canyon, specifically near the North Rim. It's right by Navajo Bridge. And the goal is to study and not leave a trace. So we'll be talking about leave no trace principles in a bit, but I'm just wanting you to think about the importance of behaviors, because on this road outcrop, this was on a field course that we had many years ago, This student and others were doing great scientific work, and they set a good example for the people that were watching them, the general public. So let's just say that a person was not this individual, but a different one was at the same rock outcrop, and they were hammering and chiseling away at the chert nodules that are seen. That's exactly what the student's looking at. And they're taking them out of the rock face, and a family of, let's say, 4 or 5 say, oh, let's go do the same thing. What they may not realize is that that property is protected. Is it federal? If you get there, you'll see what I mean. And either way, it's not permissible in this particular case. So you have to think about the actions that may seem okay, even if it's within the bounds of the law. How is it perceived by other people? Why do people feel empowered to do things that are not okay? Is it because they see other people doing it first? And if the answer is yes, is that a geoscientist making that example for others to see? Geoscience ethics aligns with just general scientific ethics of collection. So let's take a look at this particular fossil. Is it okay that this individual is taking this fossil out of context? Well, if it's a vertebrate fossil and they don't have a permit, the answer would be absolutely no. It would be a felony. Let's say that this is a piece of petrified wood. Different laws apply. Let's just say that this is an invertebrate fossil are important. But let me tell you the scientific ethics here. You take something out of its context. Have you taken part of the story with it? And in scientific research, we often do remove fossils, rocks, and minerals from the field and bring them to a laboratory to study. So when you're doing so, you need to think about collectively what's happening on a site that could be damaged by the actions that you're taking. And that's part of scientific ethics anywhere, whether it's in biology, geology, chemistry, any field of study. The idea is to gain as much knowledge as we can with as minimal impact to Earth and its organisms that live here. So we want to collect this data in such an ethical way that it can also be reproduced if other scientists go in behind us, which is part of the scientific method. You want it to be testable and your hypotheses examined and hopefully retested by other scientists down the line. So let's talk about what public lands are, because so much of geoscience work happens when you travel. Now, it'd be great if you could go to this park and it was in your backyard in Tucson, Arizona. Great, awesome saguaro cactus. So if you didn't know, these cacti require lots and lots of years to just grow a few inches of an arm, and many of them have multiple different arms, and that's what makes this place so famous. So if you're out doing work, and let's say you're not sure if you're in a public lands, you need to take a step back and find out, because it's going to determine whether you can take anything away. We're talking like even a speck of dirt. So you need to understand that public lands are owned by government entities. That does not just include the federal government. Public lands can extend to state lands. That could be a park, it could be a state trust lands, it could be even locally owned by a city. So you have to start thinking about public lands as all of these places and not just what most people consider as national parks. So that brings me to an important topic of national parks and national monuments. National parks are usually designated to protect lands for educational and recreational purposes, and they're fairly large scale. Not all, but many are. But national monuments are dedicated to protect something. So they're usually an object like you see on the right here, which is Devil's Tower, a volcanic neck. Maybe it's a cultural site, something like that. There are additional regulations for monuments that actually protect the structure itself so you can't damage and impair it. And national parks are fully protected as well. But the idea is that these are preserving places that have extraordinary significance. Could be for beauty, it could be for preserving the Earth's history, it could be for a cultural or historical significant purpose. But both of these are geologic sites. So the one that has the pillars that are sticking up, that's Bryce Canyon National Park, which is the site of the world's largest concentration of hoodoos. That's located in Utah. And then you see Devil's Tower, famous for a movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but it's a real place in Wyoming. And this is an extraordinary example of earth processes that have been protected by this unique structure. When you're visiting national parks and national monuments, all visitors, including professional geoscientists, need to comply with park regulations. What is astounding to me is that most people assume they know what the regulations are, and then they almost plead like, oh, I didn't know, when they find out something they did was illegal or not permissible. The person you see on the left is an example of who you should ask before you do. I met this park ranger when we went to Glacier Bay National Park, and he came onto our cruise boat. I got to have a small interview with him. He's just an extraordinary man, and he talked to our group about the needs and the importance of educating people about the problems that they're having with climate shifts and climate change and the protection of these remarkable glaciers. So in this course, we'll examine this very place and others like it and why it's so significant. Sometimes national parks and monuments will put signage up like you see right here in Bryce Canyon National Park on the right. And it says, do not enter. So why is it that people feel empowered that they can and still should have the freedom to do so? Because it's their public lands as well. I think that's the reason. I've asked people when I've seen this happen, and that's typically the answer I get. Oh, it doesn't matter. The park rangers do it. The animals do it. So that's justifying a means to an end. And if it's marked off, there's a reason. Maybe there's a dangerous situation that visitors would be at high risk for being buried by a rock slide or some type of a karsted situation in certain parks where you could have a sinkhole, or maybe there are protected habitats for even things like bacteria mats. The point being is you need to know what the rules are. Park rangers are your best resources. Brochures for parks and national monuments give you quite a bit of information. Sometimes they even give you do's and don'ts of things that may be permissible. And I'll give you an example. I was on a sabbatical about a year or two ago, and we visited a state park in South Dakota. And surprisingly, they allowed drone flying. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to allow drone flying in the future. There were rules associated with the drone flying, but I was a licensed pilot and we could fly, and I asked for permission before I did. I said, hey, this is in your brochure. Is this actually correct? Because it's not typically allowed in park settings. And said, oh, well, there are a few caveats. You can't disturb visitors, can't disturb natural habitat for animals, like a no-brainer. And that's even in the rules for drone flying. But I found it interesting that this park allowed it where so many others did not. So sometimes knowing what you can and can't do is just a simple answer. And I would document the date, the time, and who you visit with, even get it on videos. So if there's ever a question, you have some guidance that can say, hey, I did the right thing. I ask. Always ask. It matters. Thinking more about national parks and national monuments, understanding that there are boundaries where the parks and monuments begin and end are super important. And I would also tell you many of these boundaries can be a bit ambiguous. There's no line in the sand. There may not be a fence. There may not even be signage except at the park main entrance and where the park exit may be. You will find, especially in the western part of the United States, that many of our public lands are adjacent to tribal lands, that they're adjacent to state trust lands and state-owned lands, or other types of federal protected lands like Bureau of Land Management lands, known as BLM lands. The point is that you can't collect anything from these sites without a permit. I mean, we're talking about even a leaf on the ground, a pine cone, a speck of dirt. Certainly, as a geoscientist, leave those rocks, fossils, and minerals behind. In fact, I carry a brush in my car for my shoes to leave the soils intact that might get on my shoes as I'm hiking or walking, to try to prevent the movement of invasive species, or maybe even something that can get on your shoes that can make other animal populations sick, which is a thing in certain places in the world and in the United States. So you have to be really, really careful and think about your actions as a geoscientist. Speaking of the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, let's discuss who they are and how they relate to public lands. It's really astounding how much land that they manage. Roughly 10% of all land in the United States is administered and managed by the Bureau of Land Management. They also do 30% of all mineral leases. So you can actually purchase a mineral, if you want to call it right, for a block of land, and be able to use that to mine for rocks, fossils, minerals. Now, if they're vertebrate fossils, different rules apply, and you're going to learn about those shortly, and you would have to have a scientific permit to extract them. The same would be for artifacts. So those are very highly protected, especially vertebrate fossils and any kind of indigenous artifacts. But when you start to look at the map on the left and you begin to see the volume of land, you can see why it could be confusing. Are you on public lands? Are you not? And you see these BLM land boundaries. And if you know where national parks are, for example, let's just take a look at the state of Utah. Well, there's like 5 really awesome national parks in Utah, not to mention some just extraordinary state parks. You're not seeing the boundaries of those, but yet so much of this land is BLM land. How do you know where it starts and finishes? So on the right, you see a picture, and this is a picture in a place that is outside of Hanksville. I spent some time there at the Mars Desert Research Station, and while that is privately owned, all the property around it that's not part of that actual complex is, for the most part, Bureau of Land Management land. And then you get a little gift here or there where certain lands are owned by the state of Utah, and they're called state trust lands. Well, how is your general citizen supposed to know that? And so you have to be careful, because BLM has some interesting set of casual collecting rules that we'll get to here shortly. So how do you know if it's okay? I would always use the premise that it's not, but let's talk about how that works. Let's go a step further first, and let's look at state parks, and then we'll investigate and go back to what's legal and not legal. The park you're seeing on the right here is Enchanted State Park, which is located in Texas, and it protects a just incredible batholith, which is a igneous plutonic structure, magma chamber. This is a Precambrian age magma chamber, and you can see that it has a version of something you learned about earlier in the course called exfoliation. This is an exfoliation dome. State parks, just like federal parks, are protected lands, but they're managed by similar types of agencies that are state governed, In Texas, that would be like Texas Parks and Wildlife, but every state has their own jurisdiction. They have to have their own state rules that are similar. Now, something you should know when it comes to understanding how regulations work, the federal rules are the standard, the gold standard. Any state or local rules must be as stringent or more than federal rules. That's just the way it works. So each layer can get a little bit more intense or strict in what they're doing, from federal to state, state to local. So let's talk about those state land trusts. I was just mentioning to you the property out there near Hanksville. Well, this is another shot of that. So there was a case of some people who stole some dinosaur bones and did so. The big question was it on federal land? And at the time, the feds thought it was. But when they went out there and they actually did a GIS, Geographic Information System, and surveyed the land, they realized part of the land where the biggest part of the bone was actually on the state of Utah land in terms of being state trust lands, which we'll get to in just right now. When the individual states entered the Union, they were, in many cases, gifted land that was set aside, allocated by Congress to be used for beneficial purposes for education, to support things like colleges and universities. This is super important because out west, there's a lot of state trust lands. So if you just happen to walk onto state trust lands, let's say you were on BLM lands, that's federal lands, and then you just walk onto state trust lands, like I said, there's typically no signage. It's just, you got to know. And you take something from there that would be legal under BLM casual collecting guidance and rules. Oops, it's not under likely state trust lands. So it gets really sticky very fast. Then there's tribal lands. So tribal lands are designated by the government for indigenous people. And they're so important because they preserve a cultural history of indigenous people to our continent. These land areas are designated and run by Indian tribal organizations, so ITOs, and these ITOs have full governmental jurisdiction. It's a sovereign nation. So to go on to tribal lands, even inadvertently, and taking something like, let's say, a dinosaur bone, or let's just say a rock, or maybe you visit this place in Page, Arizona, which is Antelope Canyon, and you take a chunk of that home, well, that's their rock. Now, they can do that all day long and sell it, but nobody else can. And it's highly doubtful that they would give permission or a permit to do so. But assuming that they would, you would need that from them because it belongs to their ITO. There's another type of site that's even more protected than any of the ones that I've just described, from national parks to national monuments, state parks, state trust lands, and that's World Heritage Sites. So these are internationally protected sites. They have either natural or cultural significance. They have substantial and or outstanding universal value to the world as determined by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural World Heritage Committee. They're also referred to as UNESCO. For example, this place that I took this picture in right here, this is Glacier National Park. It's actually referred to as Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, but this is a place called many glaciers, like a lot of glaciers. This is a World Heritage Site. Its extraordinary beauty is one of the criteria by which it meets that standard, but there are 10 criteria. I'm only asking you to learn a handful of them because most of them don't apply to geoscience. The second half of them do. So let's take a look at World Heritage Sites. We're going to start with criteria VII or 7. This World Heritage criteria represents a site of extraordinary beauty. So the place I was showing you with the park ranger, that is an extraordinarily beautiful place. It's an entire ice field, and it's not just Glacier Bay. There's other parts to it that are not just in the United States. So many of these places may cover more than one country at a time, like this one does right here. But they're so significant in their beauty that they need to be protected. Oftentimes, these sites are also protected by the national government that owns them. For example, in the case of this one, the United States or Canada. I'll give you another example. The Opera House that's in Sydney, Australia, that is a World Heritage Site, but not for its extraordinary beauty, but because of its architecture. So that's actually one of the criterias. The next criteria, VIII or 8, this is one that many of our national parks that are also World Heritage Sites may qualify if they are geologically significant, for example, like the Grand Canyon. And a park could have more than one criteria that it meets, and certainly the Grand Canyon fits that bill. But in this particular criteria, they exhibit something so significant about the Earth's history that they need to be preserved. They may also exhibit the Earth's ongoing geologic processes or landforms. Well, the Grand Canyon does all of that. So it has an extraordinary history dating back to billions of years old at the bottom, and contain a stratigraphic rock record up to the surface that gives scientists an extraordinary view of the Paleozoic era once you get above the Great Unconformity, which you'll be learning about soon in this class. But thinking about that, it's understandable why the Grand Canyon would be listed under this criteria, but remember, it meets more than one standard. So that brings us to criteria IX or 9, and that represents a site that has very important current ecological and biological processes related to plants and animals on land and water. And you might go, well, why does that relate to geoscience? It may not directly relate, but it provides the habitat. The geology does. For example, this is the Everglades National Park in Florida. So this would be a depositional environment, since you've learned about that in our class. It's a swamp depositional environment, very applicable to what we talk about in geology. Moving on to criteria X or 10, this represents a site that has significant natural habitats needed to conserve biological diversity. And this is one of the highlights of going to the upper basin of Yellowstone National Park. This is Grand Prismatic Springs. So it's a hot springs. So the hot springs is protected as a thermal feature, of course, but notice the colorful bacteria mats along the edges. That is what it's so infamous for. Those are protected under this criteria. So many national parks that are also World Heritage Sites will be listed for a variety of these criteria. And that's significant for us because we need to make sure that when you're visiting them, that you also realize you might be on something that's protected additionally by international means, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Well, we haven't talked about private lands, and I just got a call a couple of days ago from someone that was saying, hey, we found fossils on lands that we just bought. We think they could be maybe dinosaurs. And they were worried to talk to someone like me, thinking that would lead to an eminent domain problem. So let's talk about that issue. Eminent domain is when the government can come in and claim private property for a necessary need for government use. And typically that does not involve taking over a fossil site. Now, there can be some exceptions to the rule, of course. Where that might be a little tricky is if you have something like an archaeological site that's significant, that's found. So if you're in that situation, here's what I would do. I would call someone like me. Hopefully you can find a trusted person in your local area. Let them see what you have. They don't need to take it from you. Just come and see them in person. Send them a couple of pictures if you're comfortable doing so. And let's see if we can't get you at least some guidance on what we think it might be before you go to the next step. So now let's talk about walking as a geoscientist and taking stuff off of public lands. Where you're like, well, I couldn't get to this place. Well, I could. I actually went to this place. This is right in Acadia National Park, but it is private lands because there are literally numerous, just if I'm going to go out on a limb and say hundreds of small little islands like this that are volcanic that exist around what people consider Acadia National Park. The big block of it is Cadillac Mountain, but this is one of the many igneous structures that exist there. And if you look really closely, I'm going to point it out right here. You're going to see this little thing right here. That is an igneous dike that you learned about earlier in the semester. Someone like me would think that's cool enough to get out of the boat and try to get some of that rock to take home, but it's on private lands. I would need to ask their permission. The only time that wouldn't apply is if that landowner does not have access to the mineral rights. So I have properties that I inherited where I own mineral rights for oil and gas, for example. Someone can't come take those from me. They have to ask my permission and lease it in order to do that. Now, most people own their mineral rights. They are not okay with people coming and taking stuff off their property without permission. So I would always ask. Now, this gets also tricky when you start getting into fossils. There is a notorious dinosaur bone case, which Dinosaur 13 was based on. And I would encourage you to watch it because it shows the complexity of what we're fixing to cover about regulations in a minute, of how important understanding different types of public lands can be. In the case of this particular story, you had some very well established and knowledgeable paleontologists who found a dinosaur bone. They did get written approval to extract the bone and even paid for it. So this is the largest Tyrannosaurus rex bone at that time skeleton that had ever been found. Well, there's an oopsie to the question. So part of the land appears to be on federal public lands, and then part of the bone is potentially on tribal lands. Now you've got a bunch of people, private landowner, the government, and an ITO all wanting a part of a multi-million-dollar skeleton, which is now known as soup. It is worth getting a lesson on how complex it can be to know and understand why you need to get really good, tight legal permission, all under the guise of hopefully an attorney to make sure all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed that could potentially come back should you have a private landowner who might decide that they really want the rights to those fossils that you found, or minerals, or rocks. Here's an example of another private land. Now this was done from a college who had permission to be there. This college actually worked with them and brought students out there. But the point being was the landowner wanted the fossils to go to research and education, and the fossils were shown in the laboratory that people could come visit and see them, and they were strictly used for educational purpose. Now, let's say a new dinosaur is found out there, a new species. That might get where things could get kind of tricky, especially if it's something like a theropod and the value of those bones skyrockets with those that are similar to like Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, the age of these rock layers wouldn't permit that. They would be different dinosaurs that were theropods if they were found, like Coelophysis. But point being is you had to have written permission. Even to go on the land, every student, and myself included as the instructor, had to have permission to go on, and we had to sign a release that wouldn't disclose the location of these people's property because they didn't want to have other people trying to come in and excavate for bones of fossils. One thing that geoscientists should do is share what they know. That's education, and a heartbeat right there. Sometimes in the spirit of education and sharing information, though, some of the world's most incredible places happen to be geologically based, like Zion National Park, for example, which you're seeing here. This is the trek up to the top of Angel's Landing, which has a chain that you have to hold on to. And if you're thinking that's a lot of people, you are right. It's too many, and that's not a very crowded day. As of today, when I'm filming this video, there is now a permitting requirement for Angel's Landing because of how dangerous and sought after this hike is. You can even see the signage as before you're going up talking about this very issue. So people get excited about what they learn in these extraordinary places like Zion National Park, especially geologists like myself, when we want to share that knowledge with the world, like I'm doing with you right now. And sometimes that takes a hold in a variety of different ways. That could be on the news, it could be in a movie. Today's world, it's social media. Who knows in 10 years what the next venue would be. Unfortunately, these things can run wild once this kind of stuff starts getting out there. There could be something like video challenges, trying to get to these places and doing special things to get your information out there, let's say on social media of some sort. I'm not saying that's bad. What I'm saying is, in any context as a geoscientist, you should share your information with a caveat that it should always be the goal of every visitor to preserve our public lands, to preserve our natural resources on the planet. So think about what you share, how you share it, when you share it, and the way you share it. It matters. Sometimes people share information, and a case in point would be Horseshoe Bend in Page, Arizona. Absolutely a breathtaking, stunning place. So when we first started going there was just a sand little pathway that went down, and it was kind of a hard hike. It's just like not even a mile. It's like 3/4 of a mile from the parking lot to the edge. Now there's a significant drop from the edge down to the bottom, and you can imagine the people on the right. This was before the fencing. I would call it the idiot-proof fencing, not to make an offense of anyone here, but that's my terminology for why these fences have to be there. But you can see that people are right on the edge, and what you're not seeing in this picture is how windy it is. Out at Page, Arizona, this place can be so incredibly windy that a burst of a wind literally can pick somebody up and knock them off. And I'm not exaggerating. This has happened, and it happens more often than it should, which is why the fencing has been built. But it started off as people just like myself sharing information about the grandeur of such an incredible place, not to mention regular tourists. But geologists have a responsibility to protect these resources, not to hide them, but to share the wonder of what they are and why we need to protect them. So now I would say part of the experience has been hindered to see this place because of the fencing, yet it's a safety issue that absolutely needs to be there. What shocks me is I just went there this summer and people bypassed the fence, still doing exactly the same thing that you see here. Just think about what you share and always put that caveat of protecting our natural resources, and a word of safety in this case would be merited as well. That brings me to the regulations. So there are lots of regulations out there about rock hounding. I don't know, people just think for the most part, it's okay to pick up a rock and take it home. Maybe, and it could be. I'm going to say in certain situations it can be. But geologists are number one people who do this. And I have a yard full of rocks. I am one of those people. But I don't take them from public lands without a permit. So let's talk about that. The collection of rocks, fossils, and minerals varies. It's not the same. It's not uniform by public lands. So that's why I had to go through all this explanation of what a national park, a monument is versus BLM lands versus state trust lands, state park lands, because they vary. Because remember, the BLM administered 10% of all of the land that we have that's public land of the United States, and well, even the surface area of the United States, and subsurface, they do even more. And so if they have that much land they're managing, imagine how that land is used, since they do 30% of all mineral leases in the United States. That means that it might be legal to take something there, but it's certainly not legal to take something from a national park, a national monument, likely not from a state park. So never take something from private lands or tribal lands without a permit. So let's take a look. Probably the most common place for a geologist to pick up rocks is along a road outcrop. Here's that Navajo Bridge, which is the Kaibab limestone. This is probably 30 minutes from the turnoff to the North Rim at Jacob Lake. These are rock layers when you have a road outcrop that either have been blasted out to get a nice roadway through them, or they're naturally eroded and weathered to where they could put a road there. Many of these places have been dynamited out, and that's why they're so nice and vertical, and you can get a really good look at rock layers. So they're great to study. So when is it okay? When is it not okay? I would always use the premise that maybe it's not okay. And if that little voice inside of your head is going, I don't think it's okay, then follow it. Okay. It's generally permissible to pick up rocks along non-major highways. Let me emphasize that part. So if you're along an interstate and you pull over, those emergency lanes are designed for just that, emergency lanes. And it's actually not okay. It's an offense to be in one of those lanes and it not be an emergency situation. They're designed to have to change a flat tire, or you have a car incident. That's what those spaces are designed for. But when you're along a lot of our state and certainly county and local roads, typically if they're not on private land, big important part, a road outcrop is probably going to be your safest bet. But if it even remotely feels like it's not right, step away and don't take it. Go ask before you do anything. For example, these are geologists who are actually collecting legally along a state highway. They are collecting just some general rocks, but you'll notice there is a fence line back here. So that's private property back here. As soon as one of them crosses that boundary marker, that's an illegal action. One thing you shouldn't do along a road outcrop, though, is destroy and deface. So if you're having to use hand tools or power tools, rock hammers and things like that to get all your rock out, then I'd say that's not okay. These are the rocks that have fallen down. So think about that as you are on your roadside outcrops. Don't destroy, don't deface. If it feels like it's in a place that should be permissible, they need to really be on the ground. You don't need to be taking them out of their space on a rock face or in a rock layer. So when is it okay to take things from public lands? Let me reemphasize, if it's not a common theme by now, national parks and monuments, no can do. Every single thing, living and inert, stays on the site. That may not be true if you are on something like national forest lands. So many national forest lands can also cross paths with BLM lands. So you might need a permit, you might not, but you should ask. But they do, and oftentimes for national forest and sometimes grasslands, even certainly BLM lands, you may be able to collect a reasonable amount, but it has to be for personal, private use and not commercial gain. All right, so on the left, I have an area that's a national forest, that's in California, and on the right, I have a really bad storm, good shot of mine, I like, from the petrified forest in Arizona. So you're going to learn in a few minutes what the limits are for petrified wood on BLM land. Well, that does not apply to somewhere like that, which is the petrified forest, but because it's a national park. You have to think about these things. So when you're thinking about a national forest, the allowable use of minerals and rocks may be for personal, not commercial use. So this is a site in between Pink Coral Sand Dunes State Park in Utah and Zion National Park in Utah. Some extraordinary cross-bedding of the Navajo sandstone. So maybe you want some of these rocks and they're in the national forest. Well, they're going to tell you, first of all, you can't deface these rocks. Okay, so that's not going to be allowable. Let's say there's some on the ground. They're going to have to give you guidance and a permit to do so. I would say this is not okay. If you go to a place like this, you should never take anything. It just doesn't feel right to me, even if it's legal or permissible. Which brings me into, when is it not legal to take things like fossils? So let's talk about casual collecting. There's a set of regulations that is called the Paleontological Resources Preservation Act. Let you wrap your brain around that word. Let's start with the paleontological. That refers to fossils. Paleo means fossils. Resources are fossil resources. Preservation means the act of conserving and preserving these fossils that are in the ground. And it is an act. So let's add that action to it. That means that it is a federal law. These PURPA rules, that's what it's referred to, allow for the collection of rocks, minerals, and non-vertebrate fossils without a permit on very specific public lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management. I didn't say national parks, national monuments. I didn't even say the National Forest Service. I said BLM. As long as several criteria are met, that there is a reasonable amount and a negligible disturbance standards are met. So what do those mean? So let's take a look. When is PURPA not okay if you meet these two criteria in a minute that we learn about? There is a bone in the ground on the right. Oops, that doesn't qualify. If it is a vertebrate, PURPA protects all vertebrate fossils on public lands. You got to have a permit to take it out of the ground. And that permit's going to still mean they own the bones. It just is typically done for educational use. So let's talk about a reasonable amount standard. Now, these are petrified wood logs in the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. But let's just assume that these are on the private lands outside the park boundary, because there's a lot of these that are. And there are people who own that land and they make a ton of money on the petrified wood that they can sell. Then legally they can, because it's on their private land and they have the mineral rights to do so. If you were on public lands, and let's just say this was BLM land, let's add another dimension. So this is BLM land, it's not. Okay, let me just using an example. And you found this petrified wood. Would this be a reasonable standard to take any of this wood that you see here? The word absolutely no would be the right answer. We can all say that those would be well over 25 pounds, but what about a small chunk? All right, well, let's talk about that. The volume of common invertebrate and plant fossils. So invertebrate fossils would be things like many of your marine fossils, like ammonites, bivalves, and things like gastropods, cephalopods, maybe other types of invertebrates, and plant fossils like petrified wood cannot exceed 25 pounds per day. The rule does not delineate 25 pounds per day by item. It says 25 pounds a day. So having worked in regulatory arena, when I worked for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the way I would have interpreted this rule to be as someone who was the regulator is 25 pounds total for everything per day. So you find a site that has a bunch of ammonites. One ammonite might weigh 25 pounds, so you're pretty much stuck with that. Well, how do you know? How can you be sure? Take a scale with you. You think I'm kidding. When I travel and I know that I'm going to public lands where it's acceptable, even private lands, I am going to take the necessary equipment to document my work, and that includes a scale that I can weigh, because that's part of also understanding the scientific ethics of how you research, how you collect, and how you report on your findings. But keep in mind, if you're finding petrified wood, 25 pounds a day. But as soon as we have vertebrate fossils, we're out of the realm of casual collecting, and a reasonable standard would not apply, a reasonable amount standard. Once you meet the reasonable amount standard, you still have a few more standards you have to look at. Negligible disturbance is the other one. All right, so I can use these two images for both reasonable amount and negligible disturbance standards. Let's just say these cool trilobites that you see here are in this rock formation somewhere. Obviously, it's not the same rock, but I'm just giving you the example. You find this really cool, huge trilobite. Let's say you find it in the middle of this rock layer. And you would have to pull down all the way, all this rock off to get to that block. First of all, the reasonable amount standard would say that the only time you could take a block of rock with a fossil in it like this one is if the preservation of that fossil, it would be compromised. So you might need to take a block of rock that's more than 25 pounds. I would definitely weigh it, and I would say, can you get it out before you have to take that big block of rock? But assuming that block of rock has to come from, let's say it's right here, and you have to take all this, what we call in geology, overburden off, the negligible standard would not apply because now you're defacing and damaging rocks. So if you have to do that, if you have to remove multiple rock layers to get to something, that is no longer negligible. It is major disturbance, which is not permissible under the casual collecting guidance of PURPA. There's another set of standards that you have to meet, which is non-powered hand tool standard. So PURPA states that small tools like geologic rock hammers, things that are used that don't have motors, like brushes, you see a student here at a permitted site for BLM land, and they are on a dinosaur dig that working with a museum that had a permit by them. So the fossils are going to the museum, but the government still owns them. Notice that the student is using a brush and he's got several other hand tools. But the person on the right is at the same site using hand-powered tools that are actually hooked to a generator. And these are very common when you're doing things like pulling out vertebrate fossils, which is what was happening at the site legally, I might add. In this part of it was a sanctioned dig site. So if you were to take this kind of tool out with you on public lands as a citizen and you're trying to extract something out like fossils, no can do. That won't meet the standards. So you can always keep in mind you have to have a reasonable amount. You can't cause that damage to the rocks and the rock formations to get to what you need and want, and nor can you use powered tools under PURPA. And keep in mind that's for things like invertebrates and plant fossils. Never can you take vertebrate fossils without a permit on any public lands. So how are these rules for PURPA enforced? It might shock you that an area like this is surveilled. And there are trap cameras, there may be drone footage, there could be actual humans on the ground or nearby that are surveilling. And cases have happened, and I'm familiar with several cases where this has been documented. And people were caught on candid camera carrying fossils, big ones, dinosaur bones, walking across the desert, and they were shocked when they were caught. So the agencies who are tasked, whether it's the BLM, it's the National Park Service, they're all under the umbrella of the Department of the Interior. They're tasked with protecting these public lands, and they should. That is their job. I do not in any way fault them for needing and wanting to protect these resources because they are and never can be replaced. The fossils that are out here are from animals that are extinct, that have been extinct for well over somewhere between, in this case, over 100 million years in time, because these are Jurassic age dinosaurs, not to mention petrified wood and other invertebrate fossils. So we need to protect this, and we need to protect the land too. Which brings me to the second set of regulations. So we talked about fossils. Let's talk about artifacts. P for paleo, right? A for artifacts. Okay, so it actually means Archaeological Resources Protection Act. ARPA, PURPA, two very different rules. ARPA came first, PURPA came later. But ARPA is extremely strict. And this is newspaper rock at Petrified Forest National Park. Someone were to deface this or etch their initials into this along with these petroglyphs, that would be a violation that would come with very steep price, not just in money, but likely and potentially jail time. So if it has anything to do with a cultural site, I'm talking like a piece of broken pottery on the ground on public lands, a spear point, an arrowhead, which is the most common thing that people want to collect, potential old infrastructure like housing. You come across that, the game changes instantaneously. So never touch and move an artifact on public land. Instead, photograph it. Find an official that would call a BLM office, the field office. Say, hey, I found this. See if you can take a GPS reading. It's important to protect these artifacts. So that is why ARPA is such a big deal. There's another thing you should consider when you're on public lands. Since drones have become such a big deal and easy to purchase, they're now quite affordable. Most people think it's just okay to fly them anywhere. Many public lands prohibit the use of drone usage, except with a permit, even if you're a licensed pilot. So, when do you need a license first and foremost? If you're using a drone that's more than 0.55 pounds, but less than 55 pounds, you're going to need a pilot's license. If it's above 55 pounds, we have a completely different story under the Federal Aviation Administration rules, FAA. But the FAA is who regulates drone usage because it's an aircraft. So think about these. If you've ever operated one, they're kind of noisy. So these scare the heck out of livestock. Imagine what they do to wildlife. Not to mention, they can be distracting to people. And people can often, if they're driving, not pay attention and have accidents. Plus, we need to make sure they're not interfering with what's happening in airspace. So all of these things are important. So drone usage is very valuable for scientific studies and provide us stuff like this that can give you perspective geologically that we wouldn't get. But you need to make sure that it is legal to fly if you have a license, whether it's an amateur's or a commercial license. But drones are typically not permissible to be used at national parks and monuments. You'll need a permit, and some state parks maybe. Some BLM lands, probably. You'll just need to find out and ask permission. But if it's permissible, I'm still going to ask that you think about what's going on around you. Who's watching? Is there a family of kids watching or teenagers? Because they're not going to know when it's legal and not legal, likely. Make sure that you're setting a proper example. And if you do see people like that and they have questions, you should educate them about what's permissible and not permissible. That brings me to leave no trace principles. There are a series of principles that are used by outdoor enthusiasts. And there is a group, it's an organization that has their mission statement to protect our public lands and the great outdoors through leave no trace principles that are shared by many people who love the outdoors. Since geoscientists fit this bill, most of them are outdoor enthusiasts and they're in places that we can and do potentially leave a trace. We should all be adhering to leave no trace principles to keep the great outdoors as wonderful as it is when we found it. That includes everything from shorelines to the tops of mountaintops. So underwater as well. So let's take a look at protection of some of the principles. I'm not going to cover them all, but as a geoscientist, there's several that I think are important to think about. Planning ahead and preparing. This one's typically done in the spirit of thinking about where you're going to travel, where you're hiking, especially if it's back country. But as a geoscientist, let's just think about where you're going. Where are you pulling off on the side of the road? Have you asked for the permissions to do your roadside collection? What about private property? What about drone flying? What about all of these things? Have you done your homework? Do you know? That's one of the leave no trace principles that I think many geoscientists could do a better job on looking at and studying before they go places. Do you know what's out there? Do you know how to, even for a national park? For example, I went to Glacier National Park, did all my homework, and I still didn't know there were stromatolites there. But a park ranger told me where to go, were to go take photos and videos, notice he did not say, oh, you can go collect stromatolites, because it's not permissible. So I might want to go take a cool drone footage of either one of these. This is Zion National Park by the east side of it, and this is out in Oregon along the coastline, go almost to Washington State there. I might want to fly a drone and get footage here, but is it legal? Is it okay? I need to plan ahead before I do that. Now, leave what you find. We'll get to these bones a little later, but the principle of what you find is absolutely the number one thing that geologists should keep on their radar screen is leave a trace. If you do have a permit, then you still have to fix the site after you leave it to the least disturbed as possible. But consider photographing and leaving everything behind and not doing what these people did right here. Let's not take things, first of all, especially vertebrate fossils and artifacts, just leave them where they are. Geologists often travel to save money, they camp, and so I'm going to ask that you think about how you travel, not just in car, but by foot. Travel on durable surfaces, don't go off the beaten path. As a geologist, if you are not following a designated trail like this one in Bryce Canyon, notice it is a switchback situation. And a brutal one, I might add, as you're coming up. Don't try to find a shortcut, because that's going to aid into weathering and erosion. So you're going to accelerate that, because you're not the only person that's going to do it. And likely, if you saw a shortcut, someone took it before you. And that goes to that mindset, well, if it's there, it's okay because someone else did it before me. It's not okay. When you camp, leave the campsites better than you found them. Don't take the stuff with you. Don't take the pine cones. Don't take the rocks that are on public lands. Instead, do this. Camp in a way that is productive, that is protecting of the environment and respectful to the environment. The next leave no trace principle is respect wildlife. So a lot of times people think wildlife's just the squirrels and, the bison and the moose and the elk. Well, they're really cool, and the bears. It can be other things as well. So respecting wildlife also includes plants and sometimes things like what you see right here. This is a bacterial soil mat, and many of them are protected because they are archaic and they take 1,000 years to get to this, even this voluminous of a size. So if you see something fenced off, or you see something like a restoration area sign, this is from Garden of the Gods, it says stay on the designated trail, follow those instructions. That's part of wildlife. Sometimes wildlife can be things that are actually endangered and protected, like the California condor. But respect animals. Do not feed them, because they rely on human food, which can also, some human food can kill some of these wildlife. Think about that, because now you're making them dependable on a resource that's not sustainable. They need to survive in their own habitat. Also, that could mean more encounters with humans. And in the long run, that could mean some animals could have confrontations with humans. Let's just use bears as an example. So if you're camping and there's bear-proof containers, you should always follow that, not keep food in your tents for bears to think it's dinner time. Because that is respecting wildlife, that's also respecting the environment. So there's really no nice way to talk about this next subject, and that is defacing rocks and graffiti art. But it is so necessary. And I'm going to share a few stories here because I think it matters. There's one case after another, and some of these are going to shock you, the cases I'm fixing to share, because they're astounding. Your average person with a regular moral compass, not even a scientist, would say this is not okay. So this rock is not just any rock, it's actually an artifact. It is art from not the names itself, but the rock shape itself was made by civilizations that lived here thousands of years ago. And these people came in and defaced the rock. They ruined an artifact. So that would fall under an ARPA violation. That can be very expensive and even jail time. And people are charged under these acts typically because the government has a right to protect their government property, including national parks and forests, which also extends to these. This is actually in Big Bend National Park in Texas. So let's look at one of the most horrific ones that I've seen, a woman traveled alone. And I think this is an important part of talking about defacing rocks in graffiti art. This person intentionally traveled alone over a couple of month period of time, visited numerous national parks and monuments, drew on rocks with paint that, like acrylic paint, defaced these rocks, and then posted them on social media. I might even say put some pretty good evidence with shoes in some of these pictures, and signed them all with a web name that she used for her graffiti art. Well, she was found liable, and it's no surprise. The name of her stuff were Creepy Tings. So let's take a look at some of this stuff that she did. And I want you to look at the timeline. This is directly from her court case. I wanted to show what it looks like in the court case. I mean, they're documenting, and all these photos are in their in the case that they brought to the federal level, to a court. Went to Death Valley National Park, Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado National Monument, thinking about what a national monument is versus a park, right? Protecting a thing. Canyonlands National Park, Zion National Park, Yosemite National Park, Crater Lake National Park. So that's a lot of place. That's a lot of art. But that's how she viewed it, was art. It's graffiti. It is rock defacing, no matter how you slice it. It is illegal, and the person deserved to be charged with these crimes. Here's some more of that. And just keep in mind, the person traveled over that spectrum of time alone. There was a reason they traveled alone, but why did they feel like they needed to put it on social media? I just don't get that. So these things have been put all over the Southwest, and it's shameful that they happen, but this is an example of an illegal act. So there's another element of problems for people that damage rock formations. So I'm not saying that the woman that I just showed you pictures of didn't damage. She did, but the legal term was deface and rock art. The case I'm fixing to show you is worthy for you to do a search for the video that goes with this. And I don't think you will have the same perspective that a still shot does. These are from their YouTube video, this very infamous YouTube video. So there was a pair of Boy Scout leaders that had a troop that went to Goblin Valley State Park, which are home to a bunch of hoodoos that look a lot different than the ones that are in Bryce Canyon National Park. They're also much older, I might add. State Park, keep that in mind, but it doesn't matter. They're still going to get hammered because this guy is singing on the video, "Wiggle it, just wiggle it." I can't even do it justice. It just makes me sick. So there's a group of young, impressionable young men watching a respected Boy Scout leader with, I guess, their assistant troop leader or the other troop leader, who didn't stop the action. And I think that's an important part of the story. That means they assisted with it. So if you're in a situation where someone you're with is doing something illegally, you need to stand up and say no, even if it's not in that comfort level that you say, I just don't want to rat on anybody. If now you're culpable. So the woman that did all that travel, she did a schedule that she planned out. She did it alone. She had full culpability of knowing there was something wrong there, what she did. She would have done it with a group of people had she thought it was okay. So this individual and the other Boy Scout leader were charged. This one did the actual damage. So what he did was push the top of the hoodoo off. It rolled and damaged this hoodoo that was, 160 to 180 million year old thing, knocked it off its top in the name of safety. That's not what the video shows at all. And you can be the judge when you watch it. So they faced potential 5 years in prison and a $5,000 in fine and restitution. They ended up having a settlement, but the charges were filed against these guys, and they didn't get off the hook so easy. That gets back to these cases like the bones I showed you. So these bones were in the ground, And these people had to go back on their own time when people weren't watching and steal them. And then they photographed it. So there's now photographic evidence. They used equipment that didn't belong to them to extract them from the ground. So they damaged the ground and the rock formations in them. And you can just read between the lines the rest of it by looking at the damage to the fossils. This thing stands from the ground all the way up to my shoulder. There is so much wrong with that in every capacity because it was collected on federal lands, at least it was thought to have been, and it turned out to be on state trust lands for Utah. This is now back on display in a museum that the state of Utah now has the bones back in their possession. Let's look at another case in British Columbia. This man got jailed and fined for using a sledgehammer to dig up dinosaur fossils. Now, this is even in a foreign country, so just understand it's not unique to the United States. Guy in the lower right-hand corner, I blocked out his name, but it's a case you could easily find the individual's name, but I will not defame anyone. A man was digging on private property with permission, and then if you read the case, he kind of didn't tell the full story about what he found and told the landowner he found something which he did find, but he didn't talk about what he found underneath. That was a very exciting dinosaur vertebrate fossil that could be sold for a lot of money. So you can see where that might go and why people might be charged. The point is that theft of rocks, fossils, and minerals is a big business out there. And that's why there's an enforcement program for it. So just leave no trace. Take a picture of this stuff. Do the right thing. That's why geoscience ethics is so important. This is a geology field course group, and they're looking for petrified wood on public lands that's BLM, and they're looking for stuff that's this size. And actually, I might tell you this is before PURPA was ever passed. I should disclaim that. But even not, they're still looking for the little stuff. It would fall under that 25 pounds per day. You need to follow the rule, though. If people are looking, are they going to feel empowered? What if they find a giant log that's more than 25 pounds? Are they going to, because they saw this group doing it, are they going to think it's okay? So as a geoscientist, you really need to be thinking about what are you doing to set the example for the public, even if it's legal and permissible, is it still morally okay? So I am going to talk about purchasing rocks, fossils, and minerals from rock shops because this is a dilemma. So let me frame this first. It's the largest rock, fossil, mineral gem show in the world, and it happens every year in Tucson. And there are rock hounders all over that bring their stuff from all over the world. Now, these particular coprolites, these are trace fossils from vertebrate and animals, and particularly dinosaur. So coprolites are fossilized poo. I talked to the people who collected this because they did have private lands that they had information from. And I made them show me on X marks the spot for where they found this, because this really captured my attention. I really appreciated the signage they had, but I would have appreciated also a map that showed where they got this from, because most of this type of dinosaur stuff is on public lands. And if it is a vertebrate fossil, which this is a trace fossil, qualifies under PURPA as non-collectible because it is from a vertebrate animal, that would have been illegal to sell if they hadn't had a permit. And even then, you can't take these things for commercial use off of public lands. If a rock shop won't tell you, or a store owner won't tell you where they got it because they don't know, they got it from some prospector, that should send a red flag up right away. Walk away. Because now you are supporting that industry. You're buying something that could be illicit. And I'm not saying you'll get a visit on your front doorstep, but it could happen, especially if there's something as big as something like the Dinosaur 13 that I mentioned earlier. It's just a good frame to ask and know more about what you're purchasing. Let's apply what you learned. You go to a place like this, is it okay to collect? You need to look and study the location. I know this is BLM land. I know exactly where this is. It's in Utah. So if it is in Utah, it's on BLM land, what can you take? Between PURPA and ARPA, you should have a pretty good feel that any artifact is off limits, any vertebrate fossil or trace fossil is off limits. If you're taking things like petrified wood, did you have to dig for it? Did you have to do anything like that? If so, that's off limits. If it's sitting on the ground, do you have a scale that can be measured the amount that you're taking? So this is a volcanic rock. Cool, it's all by itself. It's about this big, probably the size of both of my hands together. But it's sitting in the middle of a national forest. Can I take it? Can I not? Nobody's going to know. I'm all by myself. Well, is it okay? Even if it is who's watching, will it set an example that's not okay? As much as I wanted this rock, could I take it? Well, I did end up taking it, but I asked permission because it wasn't just in a forest, it was on private property within the national forest. And they said, sure, take it for educational purposes. But I wrote that down in my log, who I talked to, the date and the time. But had I not gotten that permission, that rock would have stayed right where it was. This is a place that I would highly encourage you go in Nebraska. It is Toadstool Geologic Site. But the first thing you see as you're getting into the trail is fossil collecting prohibited. And then there's a list right next to it. If you read a little further, meteorites are prohibited from being collected. I thought that was pretty ironic. Artifacts, but it did say you could take a little bit of minerals like gypsum. And if you see signage like this, you need to look a little harder and remember that it says fossil collecting. It didn't say just any like vertebrate fossils or, oh, you can take petrified wood. It said fossils. So it's all fossils if it says something like this. This is a place that is a national monument. There is access to this right outside the monument boundaries. If this was a geology group, these people would have followed, and it's very dangerous. So I've seen this happen where families with little children, they might have sandals on. This stuff will tear you up and you can get in an emergency room ASAP simply by not having the right gear. These people don't have gloves. It's dangerous. So I'm going to tell you that think about what you're doing, where you're going, how it looks. Do the right thing. When you travel, always follow the rules. This is Sedona, Arizona. Stay on the beaten path. Set the example when you're studying your geology rocks. Like this is a really cool place to see the Fort Apache limestone here in Sedona, which totally doesn't belong in Sedona. So later in the semester, you'll learn about why. Do the right thing. People see you studying. Make them have an example that will want them to do the same, to follow the right same ethical approach. Sometimes in these national parks and other places, you'll see where people didn't do the right thing. And you'll see the letters that they do, like they're sending back their petrified wood from the petrified forest because they got to feeling guilty. This happens in Hawaii at the Hawaii volcanoes, national parks. And people feel really bad about what they do and they send their stuff back in boxes, and the Park Service is just astounded by how many people actually do the right thing. I would say let's do the right thing while you're there and educate everyone you travel with to do the right thing because you don't want them doing something illegal. When you do have a legal place to collect, maybe you find a place that is okay and you have permission, I would say scientifically document what you do, label your collection, date, time, specific location, mile marker. Don't leave a trace. Don't leave any trash. Make sure that you are photographing, weighing, all of those necessary things to make a positive difference. Wherever you visit, I hope that you will think about public lands, that you will put that geoscience ethics on there. And part of ethics is education. So I'm going to empower you to educate the next group of people. That's your family, your coworkers, maybe your roommates or significant others. Educate them on what you've learned today so we can all do a better job of protecting our natural resources around the world. Thank you so much for your time on geoscience ethics and understanding public lands. I'm going to leave you with just this last thought. You really can make a difference, and I will see you at the next stop. Bye.